This lesson examines the fourth and fifth chapters of Genesis. I've been using an interlinear in the past videos, but I'm going to show this comparison, this parallel instead. It does a better job, I think, as far as where we are in the text for showing the differences, which I think is of more interest than just looking at the interlinear, because I'm not going to do quite as much paraphrasing or translation as I go along as I have been, because the wording of the first three chapters were more critical in how we understand the passages, but this is becoming less so as we go along until we hit certain other parts of the Bible. So we're going to just show this one as we go along. I will paraphrase a bit of it, but then I will stop and analyze, and then we'll look at some more text and stop and analyze. So a little bit of a change of habit on this lesson. So Genesis 4 begins what you could call the second great epoch of human history, because the first, of course, was from creation to what is called the fall of man. God had given Adam and Eve dominion over all the earth, but the serpent conned them out of it, and treachery and death would be the common experience of all their children after them, and Cain and Abel would be the pattern of violence and victimization. So in this lesson, I will read part of the text and then stop to analyze, as I mentioned. So we're just going to hit some key points, but let me read the first 7 verses the way I understand it. Adam was intimate with his wife Eve, who conceived and gave birth to Cain, and said, "God has given me a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. He grew up to be a shepherd while Cain worked the land. After some time passed, Cain brought a sacrifice to the master from the produce of the land, but Abel brought the first and best of his sheep. God looked favorably on Abel and his offerings, but he did not accept Cain and his offerings. So Cain was extremely disturbed and became depressed. But the sovereign God said to him, "Why are you dejected and depressed? Isn't it still a violation if you indeed brought a sacrifice but not a proper one? Calm down. It is being returned to you, so you decide what to do with it." Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's the end of that section of verses. And obviously there's some key points in there that are different from even both of the ones you'll see on the screen here. So the first thing we see in this chapter is that children began to be born, the first of whom was Cain. And we recall the previous lesson about the serpent seed theory. It states clearly in verse 1 that it was Adam and not the serpent who fathered Cain. Some claim that the serpent fathered Cain and that this bloodline was what Jesus meant in John 8:44 when he told some people that they were of their father, the devil. But not only does this context there in John 8:44 clearly speak of spiritual matters rather than genetics, verse 1 here explicitly states that Cain's father was Adam. Another question to address here is the claim of some about pre-Adamic races, or a race that was wiped out between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 on the basis of 2 points. That the Hebrew text there says the earth became formless, and that when Cain later went to a distant city and married, there had to be prior civilizations for him to go to. But remember what Paul said about sin entering the world through one man, and that being Adam. So whether it's a pre-Genesis 1-2 race or unnamed children from Adam and Eve, any who lived before Adam's rebellion would be sinless and probably immortal, since none of them would have been a part of God's curse. They are conspicuous by their absence. So here's how I would answer the 2 claims. For the alleged race between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, why would the Bible go into detail about the great flood but be completely silent about a catastrophe of far greater magnitude? Because they say that the earth was completely wiped out and all these pre-Adamic races were wiped out too. Not one hint of that in the Bible anywhere. So the Septuagint, the Greek that you see there, with the translation of on the left, also gives no indication of the earth becoming, as you recall when we went over chapter 1. It never says anything about earth becoming void. As for the issue of Cain's wife, a question everybody asks. Adam and Eve certainly had many other children who were simply not mentioned because they weren't key personages in the Bible's overarching theme and purpose. And if anyone objects to the practice of what we now call incest, which had to be the case when the human race was just beginning to multiply, such a law was not yet given or needed. The reason God would later prohibit it is because of the ever-degrading nature of our genome and the errors that had built up by them, which would result in mutations. So God's conversation with Cain is significantly different in the Septuagint, the Greek, compared to the Masoretic text or Hebrew. And it's the Hebrew, which I had in mind in the previous lesson when I said something about the first failed attempt at persuasion. That version has God saying to Cain that sin was crouching at the door, but that Cain would need to overcome it. But the Greek has God telling Cain that he would have his offering returned to him so he could have another chance at doing the right thing. We can only speculate as to the reason for the rejection, but it seems that since the text points out that Abel brought the best he had, then Cain did not. I don't believe it was that Cain didn't bring an animal, but that the produce he brought was of inferior quality, because it points out that Abel brought the best of his flocks. Admittedly, the Greek wording is difficult to follow, but I think this interpretation makes better sense of the immediate context. But most people seem to view it as the reason for what happens next in the chapter. So the question is which context it really goes with. And I'm sorry, I think I've had chapter 5 up here. I meant to have chapter 4. And I wasn't paying attention. Sorry about that, all that confusion. But we can see the text that I was referring to, where it says right there that Adam was Cain's father. It says it in both texts, and there's no question about it. So you can visit the link in the description to see the comparison if you want to go verse by verse. And so we're going to get up to the part now, verses 8 through 16. But again, it's very different. What I read is even different from the Septuagint as typically translated. And some of these have been done a long time ago. And so I can't, I'm just grabbing something that's easy to present. So you might have to do your own research on finding a better Septuagint translation. There's also the NETS, N-E-T-S, Bible that uses the Septuagint for the Old Testament. But again, take everything as this very strange and unfortunate habit of most translations since the King James, always deferring to that and not wanting to deviate too far from it. It isn't because it's the best, it's because it's a tradition and people are afraid to mess with that. So at any rate, we can see there that starting in verse 5 at the top on the left here, or on the right, but I'm looking at the left of the Greek text translation, that the wording of even the Septuagint here, the Greek, is very oddly put. It doesn't make much sense as a translation, and the Hebrew has a very different meaning, as I mentioned. So all I can do is tell you what I think after looking over a bunch of things, that I think what was going on here is God is saying, I've rejected your offering to Cain, and saying, try again, basically. He's saying, I'm giving this back to you, because there's remember that word apostrophe from the previous lesson. It doesn't mean submit, it doesn't mean master something, it just means to turn around and go back. So what God is telling, I don't know why the habit is of the translators of the Septuagint to always have it something to do with submission, but the meaning of the word is to turn back. And so God is giving back the offering and saying, Cain, it's up to you what you do next. So either way, I think it fits with the next passage, starting in verse 8, under the highlighted text that I have there. And here's how I would put verses 8 through 16. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. After they got there, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the sovereign God confronted Cain, where is your brother Abel? How should I know, he retorted, I'm not his guardian. "What have you done?" the master demanded. "Your brother's blood shouts to me from the ground. So now you are accursed from the earth that opened up its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, but it no longer yields good produce for you, you will be miserable and weak." Then Cain replied to the master, "My crime," this is a difference from the Hebrew text, "my crime is too great for me to be forgiven. If you banish me from the earth and from your presence, I will hide in misery and weakness on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." "Not so," replied the sovereign God. "Anyone who tries to kill Cain will suffer 7 times as much punishment." So the sovereign God marked Cain so that any who would find him would not kill him. Then Cain left God's presence and settled in the land of Nod across from Eden. Sorry about that. Now let's go back and look at this, and let me roll this down just a little bit so we can see just the verses 8 through 16 mainly. And what I find particularly striking, pun intended, about Cain's retort to God is the dripping sarcasm of not being his brother's guardian. That's why I went ahead and paraphrased or translated that section. And by the way, the difference between a translation and a paraphrase is that a translation is from one language to another. No matter how it's done, it's a translation, whereas a paraphrase is actually from a rewording in the same language. So, for example, the original Living Bible was in fact a paraphrase, not because it was put in modern language, but because it was translated from the King James, which is English, to more modern English. So that's a paraphrase. But a translation such as the New Living Translation is a translation no matter how anyone thinks how good of a job anyone thinks they did, is from Greek and Hebrew to English. That's a difference in language, therefore a translation. And really what I've been doing here is also translating. I've been calling it a paraphrase mainly because it's a very loose translation, not loose in terms of bad a changing of the meaning, because I'm showing the original text as I go, but also mainly because it is put in a thought for thought, which again is not a paraphrase. Thought for thought is not a paraphrase. The point of translation is to communicate, and whatever is the best communication, the best word meaning is a better translation. And again, you can use the interlinear for technical translation if you want to do that. So, at any rate, what I think Cain is saying to God is very sarcastic. Because his father Adam failed at guarding Eden and his mother Eve failed at guarding Adam, so he seems to be trying to shirk responsibility for his actions by rubbing in God's face the fact that he, unlike his parents, was not charged with protecting anyone. But just like his father Adam, he shifted blame from himself to God. So this attitude was already evident in his prior attempt to appease God with a substandard offering. So Cain has issues from the get-go. He is trying to use very underhanded tactics to disrespect God, first of all, with a substandard offering, and then saying, hey, you never told me to guard my brother, so why are you having a problem with me? So, of course, God wasn't having any of that, and he pronounced a curse on Cain himself, as opposed to when God cursed the ground on Adam's account. Here, he curses the person. So, and here again, the Greek wording is significantly different from the Hebrew wording, which has Cain saying his punishment was greater than he could bear, rather than that his crime was too great to be forgiven. Those are completely different things. It seems to me that the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, almost seems to try and garner sympathy for Cain, saying, you've punished me too harshly, let's have some sympathy for Cain, whereas the Septuagint says that Cain feels really bad about what he did and that he shouldn't even be forgiven. So just to make that point. Now, if I scroll down a little bit so we can see more of the rest of the chapter, starting in verse 17 through 26, of course. I'm not going to go read through that since it doesn't seem to have very significant differences between the Greek and Hebrew on that part. First off, we see that Cain marries, and we've already addressed the issue of where she might have come from in a previous video. But keep in mind that names are often given to more than one person, just as people have always done since then. We see the name Enoch But we know this isn't the Enoch mentioned by Jude in Jude 1:14, because that Enoch was in the 7th generation after Adam, while this one is only the 3rd. Genealogies are mentioned in a prior lesson, but they only began with Noah's son Shem. But here we see that Noah's father Lamech traces back through Methuselah to someone called Mehujael, to Enoch, to Cain. And why does that matter? Because then what becomes of the serpent seed theory from the line of Cain, since Noah is in Cain's genetic line? How can they say that Cain's line is satanic when Noah, the only righteous person saved through the flood with his 3 sons and their wives, is in the line of Cain? How can Cain be an evil satanic seed if Noah came from his line and no one in any other line made it through the flood except him and his 3 sons and their wives, and his wife? Some claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls cite Satan as Cain's father, but you can see the text yourself in the first resource link in the description. You can go check it out. I went and looked for several resources. It says that Cain and Abel were brothers, and it says nothing about Satan. The second link says the man fathered Cain. And you can look further into the modern push for this ridiculous theory. It's not new, but it's being revived at the third link. So check those out for yourself. You can see translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see lists of what parts of the Bible were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and see for yourself whether or not this theory has any merit to it, especially the third one is being heavily pushed by a person who is blatantly plagiarizing other works and leaving out parts that don't support his serpent seed theory. Now, the rest of the chapter here is genealogy, but it includes some interesting remarks about the originators of things like music and instruments, metallurgy, raising cattle, and so forth. Verse 23, you can see there, begins the account of Lamech, who killed a young man, and this is the father of Noah. Though it isn't clear in the Greek text whether the young man was killed for wounding Lamech, or that Lamech was grieving over the youth's death, as it has it more in other translations, it's interesting that he claimed even more protection for himself than God gave to Cain, though God doesn't say so here. So Lamech is just claiming that because he killed someone, he should be protected, just as Cain was, even though Cain committed murder, and it seems like Lamech was doing self-defense. So it's just reported. It's not explained really in the text. And then the last 2 verses name Seth as another of Adam and Eve's children. So Seth is the 2nd generation. And then Seth fathered Enos, which is not Enoch. Different person, different name. And notice also as we go along that it's been Eve who is naming her children, and that she considers them blessings from God. Just as something to point out as we go through the text, that it isn't always Adam naming people, it's Eve at the start. The Greek text differs from the Hebrew text in the final sentence. The Greek says that Enos hoped to call on the name of the sovereign God, but the Hebrew text says then men began to call, or people began to call. So neither reading is actually very informative, but it's just to point out a difference between the two. But again, what can you do with that, since the Bible never really explains what that means? People can speculate and say that that means people started to actually try to reach back to God, who had, driven Adam and Eve out of the garden, and sometimes still spoke to people like he did to Cain, but not on a regular basis. And so again, the Bible doesn't tell us how to take that statement or why it's there. It just doesn't. It's just reporting something that happened in history. And then going to chapter 5, we have another kind of a subtitle, like a separate scroll that this was written on, where it has kind of a heading to it, or subtitle, you could say. But this one is saying that what follows in the writing is focused on the genealogies, not on creation week necessarily. And this one goes from Adam to the 3 sons of Noah. There's some information that's repeated from chapter 4, but it has added details such as ages and lifespans. Then we see the famous Enoch, called by Jude the 7th from Adam. But it must, when Jude says the 7th, it must include Adam as the first from Adam, although it's kind of iffy there. But If you count the number of generations, you only come up with 6 after Adam, but the phrase seventh from Adam may be inclusive. Then there's no problem with that. That's a common thing, especially when it comes to timing in the Bible. But aside from being the father of the longest lived person ever, which was Methuselah, Enoch was taken alive at the age of 365 years to be directly with God. The Greek word there is metathekein, metathekein, and is found in Hebrews 11:5 when it reports on this event. So Hebrews 11:5 reports back on this and uses the very same Greek word. And it means to be transported, not simply to disappear, but to be taken somewhere. And this is a kind of snatching that we have mention of that word in the New Testament, which is harpazo, but this is not the same word. It just means to transport. It depends on the context. Again, the range of meanings. In some contexts, it will refer to a deserter, someone who turned away, ran away, and disappeared from where they were supposed to be. But in this context, Enoch was taken because he was good. So he wasn't deserting. God took him, it says. He didn't leave of his own accord. He was just taken by God out of the world. So this is a kind of an interesting and unprecedented leaving of earth. Not even Adam and Eve left that way. Nobody did. And the only other person we'll see in the Bible, in the Old Testament at least, who is taken alive to God's presence is Elijah, who was taken to heaven in the fiery chariots of fire. And of course, there's a movie named after that. But the point being that both of them are taken by God in the Old Testament times without having to die. Now, everybody wants to know if this Enoch wrote any books. And there's a good article that I'll have in the description that does a good analysis of the books of Enoch. And I've read all 3 of them, the best attested ones, if you will. And 2 and 3 are pretty easy to dismiss. Their content is just obviously lower and not in line with what you would expect from Scripture, or even good literature of the time. It's just very fanciful and seems to be more copycat or later work. But we have to be careful even with First Enoch as whether or not we have the authentic one, because there are forgeries. But even so, assuming that the copy I have or any of the copies I've seen of Enoch 1 are authentic, I don't really see anything in it to give me the impression that it contained hidden or secret knowledge, or that it supplied information that's vital to our understanding of any of the things of God. It may be interesting as a historical book, if it's accurate, but I really don't see any need to force it into the biblical canon. It just doesn't say anything as far as spiritual issues go, or some people will say that it'll tell us details about cosmology or give some more backstory to things that are just touched on in the Bible. But as the link about the thorough analysis of Enoch will point out, the fact that it's filling in blanks is kind of suspect, because that's what you would expect from someone who's like, hey, I want to know more backstory on these people, so I'll just write something. So go ahead and read that article for yourself, though, but it's a very good point in my opinion. And again, I don't think there's any need to have books of Enoch. The Bible never talks about a book of Enoch. It just says that Enoch prophesied some things. So that's all I'm going to say really about Book of Enoch. I'm not going to give it a lot of importance or undue attention, because this is a Bible study, not in every book that people think should be in the Bible study. And that's really it for chapters 4 and 5. I think this is a good place to break. It's not as long of a lesson, but the next one, chapter 6, is where we read about the build-up to the Great Flood. And we'll discuss the issue of giants and all the other factors that led up to that. So again, take a look at those links in the description and follow up with that before we watch the next video. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.